Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm having listened a bit over the last few days. I'm going to say things that are in many ways the opposite of what has been said, which is anyone who knows me knows I get invited to speak a lot of places once. ERF, on the other hand, I think this is my 5th time speaking for the ERF, so they only take about 4 or 5 years to recover from the previous time and make the same mistake. So I want to argue something that you don't often hear, which is that the future of jobs is actually facing a massive negative externality. And the massive negative externality is that the rich countries of the world, through their border-based barriers to the mobility of unskilled labor, have created the world's largest price distortion by orders of magnitude. Order of magnitude in the technical sense of factor of 10. The gaps induced in the price of unskilled labor are a factor of 100 larger than the prices induced by barriers to trade in goods. A factor of 100. So, as I will argue and show with data, the price of exactly the same intrinsic productivity labor differs by a factor of 10. Again, we economists are used to discussing things in terms of percents. But a factor of 10 is 1,000% price differential of exactly the same intrinsic productivity labor, entirely induced by policy-based distortions. What are these policy-based distortions? The fact that if you attempt to travel to the United States, someone with a gun meets you, and they say, "Where are your papers?" And if you don't have zip papers, you don't get into the United States. And that set of complex restrictions on the ability to work has induced the largest price distortion available in the world today and probably in the history of mankind. Second point I want to make is that technology is not manna from heaven. Technology is not endogenous. Technology responds to relative prices. If you distort relative prices, you distort technology. So what we have in the world today are the world's scarcest resources economizing on the world's most abundant resource, which is completely, totally perverse. We have billionaires who are, if you believe prices reflect scarcity, enormously scarce talent, devoting themselves to destroying labor-intensive jobs. That's their objective. Their objective is to invent machines and technology to displace low-skilled labor. What's the problem in the world today? Is that wages aren't going up fast enough. What's the wage? The price of the low-skilled labor. So we have the world's most scarce resource, the time and talent of the world's best entrepreneurs, the world's best scientists, devoting itself to driving down the wage of unskilled labor. Why? Because in the countries in which they work, you can't get to that low-skilled labor because of the border barriers. So the price distortion in low-skilled labor is creating job-destroying technological progress because of the distortion in prices. They are not responding to global opportunity costs. They're responding to local opportunity costs that are completely and totally distorted by the policy decisions of the rich countries. Those are the 2 main points I want to make. I want to follow with a point that when we discuss jobs, we want to be careful as economists in saying what we mean. Because usually and often as economists we talk about labor. Well, labor doesn't necessarily come chunked into jobs. And the question is there something special about jobs over and above labor demand And I would argue that yes, there is in fact something more special about labor than we as economists typically acknowledge, and hence not only are the technological patterns that are being induced by the distorted relative prices destroying labor, they're also specifically destroying jobs, and that is an undermining of the implicit social contract on which the capitalist system we live in has been built. 3 controversial points. Let me get to them one by one. But let me start with the motivation. The motivation is that if we think of kind of a crude indicator of the academic skills of the labor force as might be given by something like the PISA exam, and then we think of the future of demography, and demography is the one thing we can predict incredibly accurately, meaning we know how many 50-year-olds there will be 30 years from now because they're 20-year-olds today. So we actually can predict the future labor force or the future population very accurately. And countries in the world, including across MENA, face a variety of challenges. One is how skilled is the labor force as it emerges from schooling, and one is how big is the growth of the labor force. And some countries have a thick demographic pyramid, meaning their population pyramid is still fat at the bottom, which means the young population is growing. The advanced countries face an inverted pyramid. By having reduced very rapidly their fertility, they have fewer youth than they have old people. And then there's the skill set. And I want to make the point before we get into what we mean by low-skilled and unskilled is most people are making a huge mistake because they're comparing skill of labor by the years they've been in school. And they say, well, we have this many high school graduates and this many university graduates. Unfortunately, that's not a very good indicator of skill. This is the rough distribution across the levels that PISA distinguishes in terms of reading skill. They distinguish levels, 1, which means you can barely make out text, to level 6, which means you can read with sophistication and infer from the written text lots of information that's not explicitly stated. You can reason with it, you can use it. Nearly everybody in this room is in level 5 and 6 by selection, right? I mean, we're all super good readers, so we're kind of 5 and 6 people. And this is the distribution of 15-year-olds in the Netherlands. As this is the distribution of youth of the same age in Guatemala. Now, I use Guatemala because I don't want to be so rude as to use any country actually represented here. I mean, I'm rude, but I'm not that rude. But my suspicion is if you took your own country's data, you probably are in the range of that Guatemala is in. Guatemala on the standard indicators is about at 350 to 400, which is where many of the many countries are. Not all the MENA countries, and they differ a lot. But I'm using Guatemala because none of you are going to take offense directly at Guatemala. But the first thing is, there's absolutely no one in Guatemala at level 5 and 6. Like, if you actually use the numbers to estimate the number of people at level 5 and 6 in a typical cohort of 350,000 Guatemalans, the answer is 120. Like 120 people total in the country, right? Then second, the elite of Guatemala are at level 3 and 4. So the elite at Guatemala are exactly where the middle of the distribution in the Netherlands is. And then finally, 97% of Guatemalans are at the incredible tail end of the OECD distribution. Okay? So first of all, when we think of the challenge of jobs in the future, it's not just that, a lot of children in Guatemala aren't going to school. It's those that are going to school are coming out with incredibly low levels of skills. And again, everybody sort of says, oh, our education system's a bit weak. Well, it's just night and day between the functional OECD countries and what's being produced. Which means in a study the OECD did of adult literacy, the university graduates in Jakarta, so if you wanted to define a country's elite, kind of the university graduates in the capital city, the university graduates in Jakarta, Indonesia, had lower skills than the high school dropouts in Denmark. So high-skilled labor in Indonesia has the same literacy skills as low-skilled labor in Denmark. So comparing numbers of university graduates is not an indication of the skill. And then some friends of mine did a survey of youth 14 to 18 in India, and they asked this question. Girl goes to bed at 9:30 p.m., wakes up 6:30 a.m. How many hours did this girl sleep? This is not even arithmetic. You can answer this question on your fingers, right? Which is how I would do it. 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, okay? So guess how many kids with 8 years of school complete in India could answer this question? And you tell by my tone of voice it's not very high. On the other hand, it should be 100, right? This is shocking. Like, this is like, okay. I probably want you to write down something, because whatever I show you, you'll go, oh yeah, that's what I thought. You ready? 41% who'd been to 8 years of schooling could. Yeah, that's the reaction I want. Of people who were enrolled as undergraduates, only about half of them got this question right. And again, it's stunning. It's visual. You don't even have to be able to read very well to answer this question. It isn't even an arithmetic question. It's just counting on the fingers of your hand. And still, half of people who are supposedly the high skill end of the labor market in India that are enrolled in college and university really can't tell time in an important, meaningful way. Okay, so let's just be clear that for many developing countries, including some in MENA, the real challenge of the next 20 to 30 years, and it's an economic challenge, a social challenge, a political challenge, is to employ productively a big youth bulge. Lots of youth are coming into the labor market of labor that's incredibly low skilled by global standards. We want to admit the challenge of the problem is that these aren't just laborers who are low skilled relative to the concern of the OECD that even their median worker is having a hard time having adequate skills to cope with the future, but very low skill. Again, 97% of Guatemalan kids are emerging from schooling with a skill set that would put them in the bottom 20th percentile in an OECD country. And finally, you might even want to generate some exports, and depending on your natural endowment, you might not need to worry about that. Some MENA countries are blessed or cursed with the lack of concern for being able to generate exports with their labor. But many MENA countries actually have to embed their labor in things they can sell to the rest of the world. So that's the challenge. So let me get to the first 2 points about that challenge. The first point is the border-based barriers to the mobility of especially low-skilled labor have created the largest price distortion in the world today, and probably the largest in history. So how do I say that? Well, I've done actually some research of my own, believe it or not, at my age, where what we did is we just took and we compared, crudely put, we just compared the U.S. Census workers with a collection of labor force surveys from countries around the world, and we said, let's take a Guatemalan, 2 workers, of exactly the same observable characteristics. Both of them were born in Guatemala, both of them were educated in Guatemala, both of them had 9 years of schooling, both of them were 30 years old, both of them were male, both of them were living in an urban area, both of them working in the wage sector. So we run a regression in the 2 labor force surveys to predict what the wage of those 2 workers is. One works in Guatemala, one works in the United States. They don't differ except in the place they work in. Then we have to worry about selectivity, that the worker from Guatemala in the United States might have more grit or ambition or unobservable skills, and we correct for that in an econometric way, and we correct for that in a whole bunch of other ways. So we're estimating the price difference of equal productivity workers adjusted for both observables and unobservables. This is the pure difference in the wage just by being in a different place. What does it look like? And by the way, I was born and raised as a trade economist. I worked with Jaime de Mello in the trade division of the World Bank. I kind of spent my early years documenting border-based differences, you know, the distortions induced by border-based restrictions on trade. And one of the things you can create is the price equivalent of non-trade barriers. Sometimes the United States has a quota on sugar, so we don't say there's a 62% tariff on sugar. We say you can only import this many tons of sugar. Well, we can say what's the price equivalent, what's the price at which that amount of sugar that is the quota amount would be the amount demanded. So it's the price equivalent of what are otherwise non-price barriers, bans, visas, quotas, etc. So here's the answer. And by the way, if you think of what a border-based barrier does to price distortions, you need to start with the low-cost world supplier. Like if I say, what's the distortion induced in the price of sugar in the United States, I compare the price of sugar to the least cost supplier of sugar in the world. I don't go to the high-cost producer because the alternative is buying it from the place where the opportunity cost is the lowest. So the range of the top 10 countries in terms of the price distortion ranges from 500% to 1,500%. That's a factor of 5 to a factor of 10 in the wage in PPP, in purchasing power terms, of exactly the same productivity labor. This is pure distortion, meaning I've already controlled for all of the factors that would lead to productivity, and this is a huge number. The difference in wages, the average wage of these countries of that same productivity low-skilled worker is $2,600 in their home country, $21,000 in the United States, $18,000 a year difference in the earnings of an equal productivity worker by being in the US versus these countries of origin. And there's 800 million people 15 to 49 in these categories. So if you think of the world's supply curve of labor to the US market, there's 1 billion people that the wage differential is a factor of 5 to 10 of working in the US versus their home country. And by the way, there's nothing special about the US other than we happen to have the data to do the econometrics. If you just take data on occupational wages, which again attempts to control for differences in the demands and human capital of the person, we get almost exactly the same results. If we compare the top 10 countries to the bottom 10 countries by wages, for waiters, just to pick on, speaking of food service, the bottom 10 countries in the world, the average wages in PPP, so we've already adjusted for differential costs of living in the poor versus rich places, $1,300 in the bottom 10 countries, $20,000 in the rich countries. So again, $19,000 a year difference in what a waiter doing exactly the same job makes. which turns out maybe I wouldn't be showing it to you if we weren't so close, but that's amazing, right? That I just do this calculation and it's $19,000 and this calculation is $18,000. So whether I control for skills in terms of education or I control for occupations, I get the same result. So I just want to make the point that I grew up as a trade economist and now realize I was spending my time on border-based distortions that were trivial in compared to the price equivalence of what we're doing with labor. So the highest average tariff in the United States in its history was 60%. That's 60 versus 500. So again, at least an order of magnitude. If one looks at the tariffs of the rich world, and this isn't, which is the G20 is the first of those many bars, and ignore for now the gray bars, which aren't, but the actual tariffs on a variety of different sectors of the G20, they're almost all of them now well less than 10%. So the typical barrier in a typical sector to goods induced by G20 trade barriers or tariff barriers is around 5% or less. So now we're talking 2 orders of magnitude. 5% versus 500%. So all of the attention, and economists still pay a ton of attention, and rightly should, to border-based barriers to trade. They're tiny. I actually found what I meant to find, which is these authors estimated not just, they estimated the impact of non-tariff barriers, commodity by commodity, country by country. So they created a price equivalent of non-tariff barriers to goods trade, and they have the entire distribution of it. And I just want to make the point that the distribution of it tapers off at 100. Like the highest barrier you can find from non-tariff barriers to goods trade induces price differences of maybe a factor of 2. Right? That's again, if you look at these distributions, they all pretty much hit 0 at 100. The highest estimated trade barrier I could find for any commodity, and this was sugar, which is governed by a very strict ban in the a very strict quota in the United States. The highest that ever got was 124%. We had induced a price differential from a quota system of roughly a factor of 2 between sugar in the Caribbean and sugar here. Okay. So, and I think this first point is almost never talked about, almost never mentioned. I haven't heard it discussed so far in all the discussion of technology and the future of jobs and the future of labor. But if you think about it, I think it's widely accepted that the price equivalents that are induced by the border-based restrictions on low-skilled labor of mobility into rich OECD countries are massive. It's consistent with all the data on low-skilled wages. No matter how you adjust for the actual intrinsic productivity of a given worker, there's a massive premium to place. It's consistent, by the way, with the fact that the US spends a lot of money on enforcing its border. They spend $15 billion a year preventing people from coming to the United States. Obviously, if the price differential weren't so high, they wouldn't need to spend so much time and money enforcing it. It's consistent with the large risk movers are willing to take to evade these restrictions. It's consistent with the large-scale, unrealized, but expressed desire for mobility. If you ask people in the world, would you like to move to another country? Large fraction of them say yes. Few of them do. The plausible reason why they don't is they know they will be met by someone with a little hat and a little gun and will use coercion to force them not to realize their desire to move. So now, that's the first point. I think that first point, I'm trying to make it in some ways both controversial and widely accepted, which I know is odd, but it's just we don't talk about it much. We talk a lot about trade barriers and WTO negotiations and regional agreements and all of that. All of that is just enormously, completely, totally trivial compared to the magnitude of price differentials in trade. Now, the second point I want to make is that we all, as economists, believe innovation is endogenous to prices. Like, I don't know how you could be an economist and not believe that. But one of the reasons we as economists believe in the market system is we believe if we get prices right, prices reflect scarcities, then we induce people to invent things to address problems in the world by having it be profitable to address them. And one example, which I thought I had in here, but just, I'm going to, excuse me for a second. I don't. Now you know I'm not giving a presentation I've given many times before, because I. But climate change. Everybody sort of talks about the need for a carbon tax or carbon prices to be right, both to induce the right levels of consumption, but also to create the right prices of induction to induce inventions and innovation to reduce carbon emissions. And even the oil companies are in their own internal accounting imposing kind of an implicit carbon tax on the assumption that there will be greater price of carbon in the future. So everybody acknowledges the point that if prices don't reflect scarcities, because carbon is underpriced because of the externality, we should get prices that reflect scarcities in order to induce the right innovation. It's just like, if I say this about climate change, everybody agrees. Everybody says, oh yeah, absolutely, we need to, the carbon price should reflect its global total costs. Social marginal cost should equal social marginal benefit in order to achieve optimum, and that's hugely important. Okay, great. Pharmaceuticals. There's no way to look at the pharmaceutical industry and not see that prices induce innovation. Viagra. The fact that one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world's largest single selling drug item addresses erectile dysfunction should tell you that pharmaceutical innovation responds to markets, not necessarily needs. And if you get the prices so that Viagra is reimbursed by insurance, people will invent medications that address conditions that aren't hugely medically pressing, but which have a huge market. So again, I think the point that prices affect innovation should be uncontroversial. Well, what do we have? We have prices. The most distorted price in the world is the price of low-skilled labor. What's that going to do? That's going to induce innovation that's biased relative to global scarcities to reducing the demand for low-skilled labor. We're going to destroy low-skilled labor jobs because they can't get to where people want them to be. Now, the consequence of this is, in spite of the fact that, and I'll show a slide later on this maybe, unless somebody stops me, in spite of the fact that technology, particularly information and communication technology, has increased by a factor of 10 to the 10th, so we say, well, maybe technology will help employment and wages. Well, not biased technology won't, because the real wage of unskilled males, and we just use males because they're labor force. First of all, labor force attachment of males in the United States has fallen. So first of all, only 82% of prime age males are in the labor force at all, relative to 96% in 1964. So first of all, males are just, and we start with males because it used to be labor force participation was kind of expected and universal among males, but we've eroded even the norm that prime age males are in the labor force among the low skilled, and in part that's because the wages of the low skilled have been on a steady downward trend since 1972. So this is a graph everyone who's thought or studied the United States knows well, which is basically the real wages of of lower educated males are lower than they were 40 years ago. So for all of the technology improvement in the world, it has done nothing for low-scale males in the United States. And the border-based protection of these workers from competition by immigrants has not benefited them. Or at least hasn't benefited them in absolute terms. Maybe counterfactually it has. But the important question is, perhaps the attempt to protect these workers from foreign competition from low-skilled labor induced the invention of technologies that destroyed the labor demand for their skill set. So the endogenous response of innovation thwarted the attempt to raise wages by blocking low-skilled migration. So I just want to show a little graph that sort of tries to distinguish between jobs and employment and tries to distinguish between low skill and high skill. Because a lot of what is being discussed does not sort of distinguish between the effect of technology on lawyers, kind of small scale, self-employed practices that are high skill, and janitors, or between high skill employment in large corporations and low skill employment in large corporations, which are jobs, structured, contractual, benefit, taxed jobs. So and there's a number of effects that kind of are induced by the technological innovation, induced by the price distortion. What happens when we raise the price of something tenfold relative to its global opportunity cost, which is what we have done, we meaning my country in particular. First, we should generally replace labor by capital. We've just made labor really expensive and unavailable relative to capital. Second, we're going to induce skill-biased technical change. Not are we just going to replace labor with capital, we're going to replace low-skilled labor with capital. Then we're also going to look for technological shifts that shift labor from jobs to non-jobs. So Airbnb, which was being celebrated, isn't it wonderful how Airbnb has created all these rooms in the world versus Marriott? Well, kind of when you work for Marriott, you have a job. The people who clean the houses for Airbnb, they don't have a job. They have employment. Maybe we care about that, maybe we don't. I'm going to argue in a few minutes that we should. But this is job destroying even within employment. Because there's a big difference working for Marriott cleaning hotel rooms and working on a contractual basis for individual homeowners who rent their homes through Airbnb. Uber is just a wholesale destruction of jobs for employment. Then third, by the way, we invent technologies that shift things from employment to machines and home employment. So a dishwasher, right? Like, why do we have a dishwasher? Well, we have a dishwasher because we don't have somebody in our house who will wash our dishes for us. Why did anybody invent a dishwasher? Well, they invented a dishwasher in part to get you to do the work. Somebody else, there's 1 billion people on the planet that as a US citizen would have come and washed your dishes. Would have been happy to come and wash your dishes, but instead you have a machine and you wash your own dishes. So there's a massive shift from employment to home production with machines. Like, I mow my own lawn. I hope everybody recognizes that's really stupid, right? Like, somebody with my global opportunity cost mowing their own lawn, and I'm combining my labor with a really sophisticated machine to do something that 1 billion people on the planet would do for me if they weren't legally prevented from doing so. And then finally, we shift, technology is shifting from employment to unpaid labor. And I know you don't think about it this way, but every time you book your own travel, you've destroyed a job for a travel agent, and you have combined with a computer to produce a service for yourself. Again, that's completely, totally crazy at global opportunity costs. But I book my own travel all the time, so I've taken, and when I check in online at the airport, I've destroyed a job for somebody who had a good job at the airport checking me in favor of me taking on the labor. This isn't even labor saving. This is labor inducing because I'm terrible at it. Like, this is anti-Adam Smith. This is the re-non-specialization of labor. All of you people have become travel agents. All of you people have become people who check people in at the airport. That's crazy. But they've invented machines and technology that allow you to do it, in part because it's really expensive to have somebody at the counter in an airport in New York. So, the self-driving vehicle, I think, if I had to think of an image of evil in the world, this is the image of evil. This is billionaires inventing a machine to destroy low-skilled jobs. Like, how are we celebrating that? How are we tolerating that? And they're doing it because, why? Well, there's 4.5 million people in the United States who drive vehicles for a living, and they're really expensive. So here is the hourly wage of, so this is the hourly wage of people who are long-distance truck drivers in a variety of countries, from Malawi to Indonesia to Mexico to Zambia to the Philippines. This is 50% over their hourly wage, just to say you'd have to have a wage premium to be willing to come to the United States. This is how much more they would gain by working in the United States at U.S. truck driver wages than the truck driver wages plus 50% in their home country. And it's about $35,000 a year, which means that Larry and Sergey, our Google friends, are facing a cost of drivers, and Amazon is facing a cost of drivers, and UPS is facing a cost of drivers that is $35,000 a year higher than the true global opportunity cost. So what are they going to do? They're going to invent a machine and destroy those jobs because of that distortion. And it's not that this is just technology happens. This is not something that has to happen. This is not something everybody says, oh, robotics is going to happen. Robotics is happening because of this price distortion. It's not happening because of technology. It's happening because relative prices are so distorted, right? Then, and by the way, is anybody keeping track of time? Are you keeping track of time? You have 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes, thank you. Good, okay. So, I'm going to skip some slides since I have some 5 minutes, but there's a new study on what happens. The United States actually had a program of allowing people to come from Latin America to harvest crops in the 1960s. They got rid of that employment, so they got rid of 20,000 year seasonal workers coming. And when you look at it, what happened is zero impact on employment of U.S. workers in seasonal agriculture. What happened is technology changed. When you couldn't get the labor, you just invented technology to do it, or you changed the output. There was no change in this is sort of the with and without states that did and did not have these guest workers, and this is the evolution of employment. It had no impact. So I just don't know how one looks at, we've had a 10 to the 10th improvement in computing power since 1964. 10 to the 10th. By the way, 10 to the 10th. We can't even imagine 10 to the 10th. The improvement in computing power is 10 to the 10th. If you drive your car on the freeway at 60 miles an hour, 10 to the 7th faster than that is the speed of light. So computing power has improved more in the last 50 years than the difference between the speed you drive your car and the speed of light, by a factor of 1,000. So we've had massive, everybody's acting as if technology is new. Technology has been improving at the Moore's Law pace since I was born, roughly, in 1959. And what we've had is fewer unskilled workers in the labor force and lower wages for unskilled workers. So I don't know how you look at the past of Moore's Law progress and the evolution of wages and employment of low-skilled workers in the OECD and conclude that there's optimism about the effect of technology on wages. And by the way, what these rich people are doing is making the fundamental challenge of developing countries harder. Developing countries are trying to solve the social, political, and economic task of getting very low-skilled workers into productive jobs. And here are automated check-in in the airport in India. Not only are there millions of Indians who would love to come to Kuwait, not only are there millions of Indians who would love to come to the United States, there are millions of Indians that would love to check you in at the Delhi airport, but you're going to check yourself in, and you're going to use your high-skill talent combined with a machine to displace a low-skilled job in India. Final point in the last 3 minutes, which is basically jobs are more than employment. What has happened is that we have bundled together through the evolution of large-scale organizational employment into jobs, by which I mean long-term, steady, earning, contracted, formal positions. And around the idea of jobs, we've built our taxation system that funds our public goods, and we've built our social protection system. We, and again, when I say we, I'm meaning the United States, right? And now we're basically pushing people out of jobs in a way that we have no other solution for the social contract. So we really, again, what was said the other day about oh dear. What was said the other day about UBI, it's just like, you got to be kidding. Like, somehow the digital giants are going to make all these rents and pay it back to keep everybody else at an income they're happy with because they've destroyed all their jobs. And you combine that in your mind with the fact that Amazon pays zero taxes. How? So Amazon today pays zero taxes, and yet in the future, after they've destroyed all the low-skilled jobs, they're going to support all the low-skilled people with their taxes. Woo! Okay, maybe. But basically, the rest of the world is already stuck with not being able to construct an adequate social contract because they don't have enough jobs, and most of the workers are stuck in an informal sector which provides them employment and wages, but isn't an adequate basis to actually construct a social contract that provides for the public goods societies need through taxes and provides for protection against risk. And basically, the elites of the world are choosing machines over people. They're choosing to destroy the social contract in favor of an elite machine social contract at the expense of an elite worker social contract. And so this is Germany's advertisement for Germany. Right? Germany's advertisement for money to come for Germany doesn't involve Germans. It involves German machines. The world's a crazy place. Thank you very much.